southern Minnesota, 1879. While neighboring homesteaders raced to throw up 16 by 20 log cabins before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Nilsen was still building in late September. Wind cut across the prairie as neighbors watched him pack sawdust, mill trash, between double plank walls 14 inches thick. They called it wasteful, called him a fool. He spent 3 weeks on a house others finished in 4 days, copying the ice house design from the Great Lakes mills where frozen blocks stayed solid through 90-degree summers. His walls used 20,000 board feet of lumber compared to their 3,000. Then January 1881 arrived. The blizzard hit without warning, 3 feet of snow overnight, 28 below zero with 40-mile-per-hour winds that lasted 7 days. Standard log cabins with their 8-inch solid timber walls burned through 8 to 10 cords of wood that winter. Families huddled near red-hot stoves while interior walls dropped to 40 degrees. But that sawdust-filled house? It stayed 64 degrees steady, burning half the firewood. When neighbors' children got frostbite inside their own cabins, 3 families took refuge in the house they'd mocked as an icebox. What did Lars understand about trapped air and thermal resistance that made mill trash outperform solid timber by 3 to 1? If you value stories of practical wisdom that prove doubters wrong, subscribe for more documented accounts of frontier innovation that modern science finally confirmed. The sawmill's whistle cut through the September morning air as Lars Nilsen walked the perimeter of his freshly cleared quarter section, pacing off dimensions with the measured steps of a man who had built ice houses on Lake Superior. 18 feet by 24 feet, larger than the standard cabin footprint his neighbors favored, but smaller than the massive storage buildings where he had learned that double walls and packed sawdust could keep winter ice solid through the scorching heat of August. The morning frost clung to the prairie grass, and already he could hear the sound of axes ringing from Elias Porter's claim a quarter-mile south, where a proper log cabin was taking shape with the efficiency of men who had raised dozens of such structures across 3 states. Lars knelt and drove a stake into the black soil at what would become the southwest corner of his foundation. The Homestead Act had given him 160 acres for a $14 filing fee, but the real cost would come in the lumber, board feet that his neighbors considered wasteful, even foolish. At the mill where he had worked the previous winter, Ole Kristofferson had shown him the account books that tracked ice house construction, 20,000 board feet for a building designed to resist the thermal assault of summer, with walls thick enough that a man could crawl through this cavity between the inner and outer boards. If sawdust-packed walls could maintain 32 degrees when the air outside reached 90, Lars reasoned, the same principle reversed should keep a family warm when winter temperatures dropped 60 degrees below the comfort of a heated room. The first wagon load of rough-sawn pine arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday morning, Elias Porter had wandered over to examine the lumber pile with the critical eye of a man whose Civil War service had included building winter quarters for an entire company. He ran his hand along the 1-inch boards that would form the outer sheathing, noting their uniformity and the absence of the hand-hewn character that marked proper frontier construction. "Mighty thin for walls," he observed, watching Lars sort the lumber into piles according to length and purpose. "A good 8-inch log will hold more heat than all those store-bought planks." Lars nodded politely, but continued his sorting, separating the framing lumber from the sheathing boards. The foundation work had already consumed 2 days of careful measurement and leveling, creating a rectangular platform that would support walls designed for loads his neighbors never considered. Where a traditional log cabin rested its weight on a simple sill, log laid directly on stone or packed earth, Lars had built a proper foundation with fieldstone footings and sill plates that would carry the distributed weight of double walls filled with dense material. The extra work drew quiet disapproval from men accustomed to raising a cabin in a single day with nothing more than an axe and a team of willing neighbors. By the end of the first week, the balloon frame stood complete, a skeleton of 2x4 studs that formed parallel walls 14 inches apart, connected by floor joists and ceiling plates that would carry the roof load while maintaining the cavity that would hold the insulation. The framework looked substantial enough for a barn, with studs spaced 16 inches on center instead of the wider spacing that might suffice for single wall construction. Each stud had been carefully selected for straightness and freedom from large knots, and the connections had been secured with cut nails that represented a significant cash expense in an economy where most settlers built with wooden pegs and leather lashings. The outer sheathing went up next, 1-inch vertical boards that covered the frame from foundation to eaves in an unbroken skin designed to shed wind and weather. Lars worked with methodical precision, checking each board for fit and ensuring that the joints remained tight enough to prevent air infiltration. At the Great Lakes ice houses, he had seen how even small gaps in the outer walls could create convection currents that would melt tons of stored ice. And he understood that the same thermal principles applied to a house where the goal was to keep heat in rather than cold in. The vertical installation meant that any moisture that penetrated the wall would run downward rather than collecting in horizontal joints, a detail that reflected hard-won knowledge of how buildings failed in the harsh climate of the upper Midwest. Anna Nielsen watched from the temporary tent where the family had been living since their arrival in May, noting how her husband's methodical approach differed from the festive energy of a traditional cabin raising. There were no large crews of neighbors, no communal effort that would complete the walls in a single day of coordinated labor. Instead, Lars worked with quiet persistence, often alone or with help from only 1 or 2 neighbors, building in stages that allowed him to maintain the precise standards required for the thermal performance he was seeking. She had kept house through 3 Minnesota winters before their move to the claim, and she understood the arithmetic of fuel consumption, how many cords of wood, how many trips to the woodlot, how many nights when the children slept in their clothes because the fire had died to coals and the interior temperature had dropped toward freezing. The first wagon load of sawdust arrived on a crisp morning in early October, dumped in a golden pile beside the half-completed house. At the mill, sawdust was waste material that accumulated faster than it could be burned or hauled away, and old Christofferson had been happy to provide as much as Lars could transport. The material was dry and uniform, composed primarily of pine and oak shavings from the mill's cutting operations, with the fine texture that packed well while still maintaining the air pockets that provided insulating value. Lars had calculated that he would need approximately 250 cubic feet of sawdust to fill the wall cavities, a volume that represented several wagon trips, but cost nothing beyond the labor of loading and transport. The filling process required patience and attention to detail that his neighbors found excessive. Lars worked from the bottom up, pouring sawdust into the cavity between the outer sheathing and the interior stud wall, then tamping it with a wooden paddle to achieve consistent density throughout the space. Too loose, and the material would settle over time, creating voids that would compromise thermal performance. Too tight, and the compressed sawdust would lose the air pockets that provided much of its insulating value. He had learned the proper technique during icehouse construction, where the quality of the fill determined whether expensive ice would last through the summer or melt into expensive waste. The interior boards went up last, 1-inch horizontal pine planks that would later receive a thin coating of lime plaster to seal against dust infiltration and provide a finished surface for the living space. The installation required careful attention to maintaining straight, level runs while ensuring that the boards compressed the sawdust fill to the proper density. Each board was secured with cut nails driven into the interior, studs, creating a structural connection that would help the wall assembly resist the lateral forces of prairie winds while maintaining the integrity of the insulating core. By the 3rd week of October, the house stood complete except for the roof, its thick walls giving it a substantial appearance that contrasted sharply with the lean profiles of neighboring log cabins. The structure represented an investment in both materials and labor that exceeded frontier norms, but Lars had calculated the economics carefully. The extra lumber cost would be recovered within 2 winters through reduced fuel consumption, and the improved comfort and safety would provide value that could not be measured in dollars alone. As the first snow began to dust the completed sheathing, the proof of his calculations would soon be tested against the brutal realities of a Minnesota winter. The first test of Lars Nielsen's sawdust walls arrived earlier than anyone expected, carried on the back of an October storm that dumped 18 inches of snow across southern Minnesota while neighboring homesteaders still had corn standing in their fields. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and bitter, with temperatures that had dropped from 45 degrees at sunset to 12 degrees by dawn, and a northwest wind that drove ice crystals through the smallest gaps in conventional construction. Anna Nilsson stood at her new kitchen window, watching the smoke from Elias Porter's chimney bend horizontal in the wind, and noted how her own breath barely misted in the interior air while her neighbor's cabin windows showed the telltale frost patterns that indicated struggling heat retention. The comparison became stark as the day progressed and temperatures continued falling toward zero. At Porter's 16 by 20 log cabin, the morning routine included rebuilding a fire that had died to coals overnight, stoking the cast iron stove until its sides glowed cherry red, and burning through nearly half a cord of split oak just to bring the interior temperature up to 50 degrees by mid-morning. The 8-inch logs that formed his walls had been carefully notched and fitted the previous summer, chinked with a mixture of clay and prairie grass that had seemed adequate during the warm months of construction, but the reality of thermal performance under load told a different story. Heat radiated through the solid wood at a rate that demanded constant feeding of the firebox, and the chinking had already begun to crack and shrink, opening hairline gaps that allowed cold air infiltration, despite Porter's efforts to seal them with additional mud and straw. At the Nielsen house, the same storm conditions revealed the effectiveness of the doubled wall system that neighbors had dismissed as unnecessarily complex. Lars rose at dawn to find the interior temperature holding steady at 58 degrees, a full 8 degrees warmer than Porter's cabin despite using approximately one-third the firewood through the night. The stove had been banked at 10 o'clock the previous evening with a modest load of split pine, and the coals remained sufficient to kindle the morning fire without the laborious process of rebuilding from tinder and kindling. Anna moved through her morning routine without the heavy wool shawl that had been necessary in their previous home, and the children played on the floor near the far wall where temperatures remained comfortable rather than huddling within a few feet of the stove. The technical explanation lay in the fundamental difference between solid wood and trapped air as insulating media. Porter's 8-inch log walls provided an R value of approximately 8 to 10, depending on the species and moisture content of the timber, but even this modest thermal resistance was compromised by the joints between logs, where chinking materials could not match the performance of solid wood. The result was a wall system that lost heat through conduction along the entire surface area, while also allowing air infiltration through gaps that were virtually impossible to seal completely with traditional materials and methods. Each square foot of log wall exposed to a 40-degree temperature differential allowed approximately 4 BTUs per hour to escape, multiplied across nearly 600 square feet of exterior wall surface in a standard cabin. The sawdust-filled walls operated on entirely different thermal principles, with the packed organic material providing an R value of approximately 20 to 25 for the full 14-inch thickness. The outer board sheathing broke the wind and shed moisture, while the inner cavity filled with sawdust created thousands of tiny air pockets that resisted heat transfer through convection and conduction. The interior boarding and lime plaster provided an additional thermal barrier while preventing air movement through the insulating core, creating a wall system that lost less than 2 BTUs per hour per square foot under the same conditions that challenged Porter's cabin. The cumulative effect across the entire building envelope reduced heat loss by more than half while simultaneously eliminating the air infiltration that forced conventional cabins to rely on brute force heating to maintain livable temperatures. Hans Weber arrived at midday with a borrowed thermometer, curious to verify the temperature differences that neighbors had been discussing in lowered voices at the general store. The German immigrant had built his own cabin using conventional log construction, and he understood the economics of fuel consumption well enough to recognize the implications of what he was seeing. Weber's measurements confirmed the performance gap. Porter's cabin registered 42 degrees at the wall farthest from the stove, while the Nilsen house maintained 56 degrees at the corresponding location. The difference represented more than comfort. It meant the margin between a livable interior and one that threatened the health of children and elderly family members during extended cold periods. The conversation that followed became the template for dozens of similar discussions throughout the settlement as word spread about the Sawdust House's performance. Weber questioned Lars closely about construction details, material costs, and labor requirements, calculating whether the additional investment in lumber and time could be justified by fuel savings over multiple winters. The arithmetic was compelling. If the sawdust walls reduced firewood consumption by 3 cords per winter, and each cord represented 4 days of cutting, splitting, and hauling labor, the time savings alone would recover the extra construction cost within 2 seasons. The improved comfort and reduced risk of freeze-related health problems provided additional value that could not be easily quantified, but was immediately apparent to anyone who spent time in both structures during cold weather. Elias Porter's response to the demonstrated performance revealed the social dynamics that often prevented the adoption of superior techniques on the frontier. Rather than acknowledging the effectiveness of the sawdust walls, Porter attributed the temperature difference to the newness of the construction, claiming that green lumber and fresh chinking would naturally provide better sealing than his year-old cabin. He insisted that log construction had proven itself across generations of frontier experience, and that any temporary advantage of the plank walls would disappear once the boards began to shrink and warp under seasonal moisture changes. The prediction reflected genuine concerns about the long-term durability of experimental construction methods, but it also revealed the psychological difficulty of admitting that traditional practices might be improved upon by innovation. The October storm lasted 3 days, providing an extended test period that allowed for careful observation of fuel consumption and temperature maintenance in both housing types. Anna Nilsson kept detailed notes in the margins of an almanac, recording interior temperatures at morning, noon, and evening, while tracking the amount of wood burned in their stove. The data showed consistent patterns. The sawdust house required approximately 60% of the fuel needed by comparable log construction, while maintaining interior temperatures that averaged 10 to 15 degrees warmer during the coldest periods. When the storm finally broke and temperatures began to moderate, the accumulated evidence provided a compelling case for the effectiveness of the doubled wall system. The community's response to this evidence split along predictable lines, with younger settlers more willing to consider adopting the sawdust wall technique, while established homesteaders remained skeptical of methods that deviated from proven practices. Hans Weber began planning modifications to his own cabin, considering whether to add a second wall to the interior or exterior of his existing structure, while Porter continued to maintain that proper log construction with adequate chinking would provide equivalent performance at lower material cost. The debate would continue through the winter months, but the fundamental question had already been answered by the thermometer readings and fuel consumption records that documented the superior thermal performance of walls filled with what neighbors had initially dismissed as mill waste. As November arrived with more seasonal temperatures, the immediate crisis passed, but the memory of those 3 October days remained vivid in the settlement's collective consciousness. Families who had huddled near their stoves while interior temperatures dropped toward freezing had experienced firsthand the difference between adequate and superior insulation, and that experience would influence building decisions for years to come. The sawdust walls had proven themselves under real winter conditions, providing the foundation for broader acceptance of innovative construction techniques that challenged conventional frontier wisdom. The morning of January 12, 1881, dawned deceptively mild across southern Minnesota, with temperatures climbing toward 35 degrees and children walking to the distant schoolhouse without heavy coats. Anna Nilsson hung laundry on the line outside her sawdust-walled house, noting how the unusually warm air felt almost like spring despite the calendar date deep in winter's grip. Across the settlement, families emerged from their cabins to enjoy the reprieve from the bitter cold that had dominated the previous month, with men taking advantage of the weather to split additional firewood and women airing quilts and winter clothing that had accumulated the musty smell of prolonged indoor confinement. By noon, the barometric pressure had begun dropping with alarming speed, and experienced settlers recognized the signs of an approaching weather system that would bring more than ordinary winter cold. The western horizon darkened to an ominous slate color, and the wind shifted from the gentle southerly breeze that had carried the morning's warmth to sharp gusts from the northwest that carried the bite of Arctic air. Lars Nielsen paused in his wood splitting to study the sky, remembering similar conditions from his years at the Great Lakes Mills, where sudden weather changes could trap work crews far from shelter, and he began making the preparations that his neighbors would later credit with saving multiple lives. The temperature drop began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with shocking rapidity, falling 18 degrees in the first hour as the Arctic front swept across the prairie like a visible wall of crystalline air. What had been puddles of melted snow at midday became sheets of ice before sunset, and the wind increased to sustained velocities of 40 to 50 miles per hour, creating ground blizzard conditions that reduced visibility to mere yards, even without additional snowfall. The combination of extreme cold and driving wind created effective temperatures that plunged well below the survival threshold for anyone caught in the open, and the storm's sudden onset trapped several families in situations that would test every aspect of their winter preparations. At Elias Porter's log cabin, the assault began with the sound of wind finding every gap in the chinking, creating a chorus of whistles and moans that indicated substantial air infiltration through the wall system that had seemed adequate during moderate weather. The 8-inch logs that formed the primary thermal barrier began radiating cold toward the interior as the outside temperature dropped below zero, and Porter found himself stoking his cast iron stove to red-hot intensity, while the cabin's interior temperature struggled to maintain 45 degrees. The children huddled under quilts near the firebox, and Porter's wife moved their sleeping arrangements to the kitchen area, where proximity to the stove provided the only refuge from the killing cold that penetrated the cabin's envelope, despite continuous burning of split oak at a rate that would consume their entire winter wood supply within a week of similar weather. The crisis deepened after midnight when the wind reached peak intensity, and temperatures bottomed out at 28 degrees below zero, creating thermal conditions that overwhelmed the heating capacity of conventional frontier construction. Porter's cabin, despite his desperate efforts to maintain interior warmth, experienced interior temperatures that dropped toward freezing while his stove consumed wood at an unsustainable rate, and the family faced the grim arithmetic of fuel exhaustion before dawn. Ice began forming on the interior walls near the corners farthest from the heat source, and the children's breathing became visible vapor, even inside the structure, indicating that the building envelope had failed to provide adequate protection against the extreme conditions. Hans Weber's situation became equally desperate as his conventional log construction proved inadequate against the sustained cold assault. The German settler had built his cabin using traditional techniques that served adequately during normal winter weather, but the combination of extreme temperature and high wind created thermal loads that exceeded the capacity of solid wood walls to maintain livable interior conditions. Weber burned through 2 full cords of split hardwood during the first night of the storm while watching his interior temperature drop steadily toward dangerous levels, and by dawn he faced the reality that his fuel supply would not sustain his family through a prolonged period of such extreme weather. The contrast at Lars Nielsen's Sawdust-Filled house provided dramatic evidence of superior thermal performance under the most challenging conditions the Al-Olam region had experienced in recorded history. The 14-inch walls packed with mill waste maintained their insulating effectiveness, even as exterior temperatures plunged to levels that overwhelmed conventional construction, and the Nielsen family moved through their evening routine without the desperate fuel consumption that characterized their neighbors' struggle for survival. Lars banked his stove at 10 o'clock with a moderate load of split pine, confident that the wall system would retain sufficient heat to carry the family safely through the night, while his neighbors faced sleepless hours of continuous fire tending to prevent interior temperatures from dropping to lethal levels. The thermodynamic explanation for this performance difference lay in the fundamental physics of heat transfer through different materials under extreme temperature gradients. The sawdust-filled walls provided thermal resistance that remained effective even when the temperature differential between interior and exterior reached 90 degrees, while the solid log construction of neighboring cabins conducted heat to the exterior at rates that overwhelmed the heating capacity of domestic wood stoves. The packed organic material in Nielsen's walls created thousands of tiny air pockets that prevented convective heat transfer, while the double-board construction eliminated the air infiltration that allowed cold exterior air to directly enter the living space and displace heated interior air. At 3 o'clock in the morning, with the storm reaching peak intensity and exterior temperatures holding steady at 28 below, Porter made the decision that would become legendary in local memory. Bundling his family in every available blanket and coat, he led them through the howling wind to Lars Nielsen's door, abandoning his own cabin to the killing cold, rather than risk the lives of his children in a structure that could no longer provide adequate protection. The journey across the 200 yards between cabins required rope guidance and multiple rest stops, but the family arrived at the sawdust house with no serious frostbite despite exposure to wind chills that exceeded 50 degrees below zero. Weber arrived an hour later with his wife and infant son, followed by an elderly neighbor whose small cabin had become uninhabitable when his limited fuel supply proved insufficient to maintain heating against the extreme conditions. By dawn, 15 people crowded into the 430 square feet of living space that the sawdust walls had kept at a steady 64 degrees throughout the night's ordeal. The interior temperature rose only slightly with the addition of multiple bodies, but the critical fact remained that no one faced immediate danger from cold exposure, while their own structures had become survival traps that threatened the lives of anyone who remained in them. The storm continued for 3 days, providing an extended test of the sawdust wall system. Under sustained extreme conditions that would have been impossible to simulate or predict during the house's construction. Throughout this period, the Nielsen house maintained interior temperatures that allowed normal daily activities while consuming approximately half the firewood that neighboring families burned in their unsuccessful attempts to heat inadequately insulated structures. The contrast between the comfort of the crowded but warm refuge and the ice-glazed interiors of the abandoned cabins provided undeniable proof that mill waste packed between double walls could outperform solid timber construction by margins that meant the difference between survival and death when winter weather reached its most extreme limits. When spring finally arrived in April of 1881, the arithmetic of survival had been written in cordwood and coal oil across the scattered homesteads of southern Minnesota. Anna Nielsen tallied the winter's fuel consumption in the margins of her household ledger, recording figures that would become the foundation for building decisions throughout the region for the next generation. 4 1/2 cords of split hardwood had carried the sawdust house through the entire heating season, including the 3 brutal days when 15 people had sheltered within its walls during the worst blizzard in recorded memory. By contrast, Elias Porter's abandoned log cabin showed the evidence of desperate fuel consumption in the scattered ashes and charcoal remnants that surrounded the structure, testimony to a winter that had consumed 8 full cords of wood while failing to maintain livable interior temperatures during the most severe cold periods. The technical explanation for this dramatic difference in thermal performance lay in the fundamental physics of heat transfer that frontier builders had understood intuitively but rarely quantified with precision. Hans Weber, whose Germanic precision with numbers had served him well in previous business ventures, began calculating the actual thermal resistance values that governed winter fuel consumption across different construction methods. A 16 by 20 log cabin with 8-inch walls provided approximately 600 square feet of exterior wall surface with a thermal resistance value of roughly 8 to 10 BTUs per hour per square foot per degree of temperature difference. During the January blizzard, when interior temperatures of 65 degrees faced exterior conditions of 28 degrees below zero, each square foot of log wall lost approximately 9 BTUs per hour, creating a total building heat loss that exceeded 30,000 BTUs per hour through the walls alone. The sawdust-filled construction operated on entirely different thermal principles that dramatically reduced heat loss while eliminating the air infiltration that plagued conventional frontier building. Weber's measurements confirmed that Lars Nielsen's 14-inch double walls provided thermal resistance values of 20 to 25 BTUs per hour per square foot per degree difference, effectively cutting conductive heat loss in half, while the tight board sheathing eliminated the drafts that forced log cabin occupants to maintain interior temperatures well above comfort levels, simply to compensate for cold air infiltration. The cumulative effect of superior insulation and air sealing reduced total heating requirements by approximately 60%, translating directly into fuel savings that recovered the additional construction costs within 2 heating seasons. The broader implications of these performance differences extended beyond simple economics into questions of survival and settlement sustainability that affected the entire region's development patterns. Families who could heat their homes adequately with 4 cords of annual fuel consumption could dedicate additional labor to crop production, livestock management, and other income-generating activities, while those who required 8 or more cords of firewood spent the equivalent of 6 weeks annually in cutting, splitting, and hauling operations that produced no economic return beyond basic survival. The time and energy savings enabled by superior insulation technology provided competitive advantages that compounded over multiple seasons, allowing efficient builders to accumulate capital and improve their operations, while neighbors struggled with the basic requirements of winter heating. Lars Nielsen's detailed records of interior temperatures and fuel consumption throughout the winter provided the empirical evidence that convinced skeptical neighbors to reconsider their construction methods. His daily temperature logs showed interior conditions that remained within 10 degrees of optimal comfort levels even during the most severe weather, while neighbor families had endured interior temperatures that dropped into the 40s and required family members to sleep in their outdoor clothing to prevent cold-related health problems. The documentation eliminated arguments about subjective comfort preferences and established objective performance standards that could be measured, compared, and replicated by anyone willing to invest in the additional materials and labor required for double wall construction. The settlement's response to this evidence divided along generational and cultural lines that reflected broader patterns of technological adoption on the American frontier. Younger settlers, particularly those with experience in commercial construction or manufacturing operations, embraced the sawdust wall technique as a logical application of proven insulation principles to residential construction. Hans Weber began planning a comprehensive renovation of his existing cabin that would add an exterior wall system filled with mill waste, while several newly arrived families incorporated double wall designs into their initial building plans rather than constructing conventional log structures that would require later modification. Established settlers like Elias Porter proved more resistant to adopting techniques that challenged traditional building methods, despite the documented evidence of superior performance under extreme conditions. Porter's response to his cabin's failure during the January blizzard focused on modifications to existing log construction rather than wholesale adoption of alternative wall systems. He invested considerable labor in re-chinking his walls with improved materials and techniques, added interior insulation in the form of quilts and canvas hung from the walls, and installed a second stove to provide more distributed heating throughout the interior space. These modifications improved the cabin's thermal performance marginally, while requiring ongoing maintenance and fuel consumption that exceeded the sawdust house by substantial margins. The technical challenges associated with sawdust insulation gradually became apparent as the construction technique spread throughout the region, providing valuable lessons about proper installation and long-term maintenance requirements. Several early adopters experienced problems with insulation settling that created thermal gaps in upper wall sections, while others discovered that inadequately dried sawdust could promote moisture accumulation and decay within wall cavities. Lars Nielsen's success had depended on careful attention to material selection, proper density control during installation, and ongoing maintenance practices that prevented common failure modes, knowledge that required systematic transfer to avoid disappointing results among inexperienced builders. The fire safety concerns that critics had raised about sawdust-filled walls proved partially justified when a cabin belonging to a recent convert experienced a chimney fire that spread into the wall cavity and burned with unusual intensity due to the organic insulation material. The incident prompted development of improved fire prevention techniques, including the application of lime dust to sawdust, fill near heating appliances, and the installation of more substantial fire breaks around stovepipes and chimney penetrations. These safety modifications added complexity and cost to the construction process, while demonstrating that superior thermal performance required corresponding attention to fire prevention measures that conventional log construction did not demand. Ole Kristoffersen's influence on regional building practices extended beyond his direct mentorship of Lars Nielsen to encompass a broader program of technical education that helped settlers understand the principles underlying effective insulation design. The Norwegian mill foreman began conducting informal workshops at his sawmill facility, demonstrating proper installation techniques and material preparation methods that ensured consistent results for builders attempting to replicate the sawdust wall system. These educational efforts helped standardize construction practices while providing quality control that prevented the installation failures that might have discredited the entire approach during its early adoption period. By the summer of 1881, the transformation of building practices throughout the settlement had become sufficiently widespread to influence regional lumber supply and pricing patterns. Local sawmills began marketing construction-grade lumber specifically for double-wall applications, while the demand for sawdust as insulation material created a secondary market for mill waste that had previously been burned or discarded. The economic ripple effects of improved building technology extended beyond individual homesteads to affect the broader regional economy, demonstrating how technical innovation in basic construction could generate beneficial changes that extended far beyond the immediate problems it addressed. By 1895, the architectural landscape of southern Minnesota bore visible testimony to the gradual triumph of Lars Nielsen's sawdust wall innovation, with more than half the new construction in 3 townships incorporating some form of double-wall insulation system filled with organic material. Hans Weber's original cabin had been transformed through a comprehensive renovation that added an exterior stud wall filled with mill shavings, creating a hybrid structure that combined the traditional log interior with modern thermal performance that cut his annual fuel consumption by nearly half. The success of this retrofit approach encouraged dozens of similar projects, as established homesteaders discovered they could upgrade existing structures rather than abandoning years of investment in conventional construction to build entirely new sawdust-filled houses. The technical evolution of the insulation technique reflected both practical experience and systematic experimentation by builders who understood the underlying principles well enough to adapt them to local materials and conditions. Where sawdust remained scarce or expensive, inventive settlers substituted shredded corn husks, prairie grass, and even cattail fluff as cavity fill, achieving thermal performance that exceeded solid log construction while using materials that cost nothing beyond the labor of collection and preparation. Ole Kristofferson documented these variations in a series of informal construction guides that circulated among Norwegian and German immigrant communities, spreading technical knowledge that might otherwise have remained localized to individual builders or specific geographic regions. The broader historical context of this innovation became apparent as similar insulation techniques appeared simultaneously across multiple frontier regions, where settlers faced severe winter conditions and limited access to conventional building materials. In the Dakota Territories, homesteaders developed double wall systems filled with buffalo grass and wheat straw, while Montana ranchers experimented with walls packed with pine needles and bark shavings that provided thermal resistance comparable to the Minnesota sawdust installations. These parallel developments suggested that the basic principles of trapped air insulation were being rediscovered independently wherever builders faced the combination of extreme weather and abundant organic waste materials that made such systems both necessary and practical. Ingrid Nielsen grew up in a world where sawdust walls represented normal construction practice rather than innovative experimentation, and her childhood memories included helping her grandfather Lars add fresh insulation to the attic spaces where settling had created thermal gaps over 15 years of seasonal expansion and contraction. The maintenance routines that ensured long-term performance of organic insulation systems became part of the seasonal rhythms of prairie farming, with spring inspections and material replenishment taking their place alongside fence repairs and equipment maintenance in the annual cycle of homestead management. This integration of insulation maintenance into standard farm practices contributed to the technique's persistence across multiple generations of rural builders. The emergence of commercial insulation materials in the early 20th century provided both validation and competition for the organic fill systems that had evolved from Lars Nielsen's original sawdust walls. Manufactured cellulose insulation, produced by shredding paper and treating it with fire-retardant chemicals, offered thermal performance similar to sawdust while eliminating concerns about settling, pest infiltration, and fire hazards that had limited the acceptance of organic materials in urban construction. However, the cost of manufactured insulation remained prohibitive for many rural builders, who continued to rely on locally available materials that provided adequate thermal performance at minimal cash outlay. Professional builders and building inspectors gradually developed standardized specifications for organic insulation systems that addressed the safety and performance concerns that had initially limited their acceptance by conventional construction industries. These standards included requirements for fire-resistant additives such as lime or borax, moisture barriers to prevent decay within wall cavities, and density specifications that ensured consistent thermal performance while preventing excessive settling over time. The codification of proper installation techniques helped eliminate the failures that had given organic insulation a reputation for unreliability among builders who lacked direct experience with successful applications. The economic impact of widespread adoption of improved insulation technology extended beyond individual fuel savings to influence regional development patterns and population distribution across areas that had previously been considered marginally habitable due to severe winter conditions. Communities that mastered efficient heating technology could support larger populations with smaller investments in fuel production and transportation, while regions that relied on conventional construction methods faced ongoing challenges related to forest depletion and the escalating costs of heating fuel as local timber supplies became exhausted through intensive harvesting for construction and heating purposes. Agricultural experiment stations and land-grant universities began systematic studies of building insulation in the 1890s, providing scientific validation for practices that frontier builders had developed through empirical observation and trial and error experimentation. Research at the University of Minnesota documented thermal resistance values for various organic materials, while extension publications disseminated construction techniques that had proven successful under local climate conditions. This academic attention helped legitimize innovative building practices that might otherwise have remained marginal techniques used primarily by immigrant communities with limited influence on mainstream construction methods. The persistence of sawdust wall construction well into the 20th century reflected both its fundamental effectiveness and the conservative nature of rural building practices that favored proven techniques over newer materials and methods of uncertain performance. Farm buildings constructed with double walls filled with organic materials continue to provide superior thermal performance compared to conventional alternatives, while the abundance of waste materials from agricultural processing operations ensured that suitable insulation remained available at minimal cost. Even after manufactured insulation became widely available, many rural builders preferred systems they could install and maintain using local materials and traditional construction skills. The historical significance of Lars Nielsen's innovation extended beyond its immediate practical benefits to encompass broader questions about technological development and knowledge transfer in frontier societies. The sawdust wall technique represented a successful synthesis of traditional European building knowledge with American materials and conditions, demonstrating how immigrant communities could contribute valuable innovations to frontier technology while adapting their inherited practices to new environments. This pattern of cultural and technical exchange characterized much of the successful technological development that enabled rapid settlement of climatically challenging regions across the American West. Modern building science eventually provided theoretical explanations for the thermal performance that frontier builders had achieved through practical experimentation, with detailed calculations of heat transfer coefficients and thermal resistance values that confirmed the effectiveness of organic insulation systems under specific installation conditions. Contemporary research has documented R values of 15 to 20 for properly installed sawdust insulation, figures that validate the fuel consumption records and temperature measurements that Anna Nielsen recorded during the winter of 1881. The convergence of historical documentation and modern building physics provides compelling evidence that frontier innovation could achieve thermal performance standards that remained competitive with manufactured alternatives developed decades later. The legacy of sawdust wall construction persists in rural regions where builders continue to use agricultural waste materials as insulation in livestock buildings, storage facilities, and residential structures where cost considerations favor locally available materials over manufactured alternatives. Contemporary applications of organic insulation reflect both continuity with historical practices and evolution toward improved fire safety, pest resistance, and moisture management that address the limitations of 19th century installation techniques. This ongoing development demonstrates how successful innovations can adapt to changing conditions and requirements while maintaining their fundamental effectiveness across multiple generations of technological advancement.